everyone. My name is Grace Beatty, and welcome to Wicked Women, the podcast. On this podcast, I will be discussing with leading experts some of history's most infamous and maligned women. Within each episode, I do not look to excuse or dispute the wrongs committed by some of these women, but I do strive to bring a more holistic and rounded understanding of each particular woman's story. Step back in time and come on this journey with me as we discover the lives and legacies of these fascinating women. On today's episode, I will be chatting with Maria, the creator of Herstorical Walking Tours, a theatrical walking tour company that focuses on the stories of women in and around London, England, through a more feminist lens. Tours include Hex and the City, Harlots, Strumpets and Tarts, oh my, and Goldbirds of London. Continue listening to learn more about the tours and the process of bringing villainized women to captivating and nuanced light. Thank you again for reaching out to me about this. I think this is going to be a really fun episode. I always like, bringing in the less common podcast episodes than what I usually do. But I realized within my questions, I didn't start off with, just introducing yourself and what you do and what your social media is, what your tours are, so that my listeners can just sort of get an idea.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Grace. It's really a pleasure. I think what you do is amazing, which is hence why I reached out. So my name is Maria and I run Herstorical Tours. So these are theatrical guided walking tours about forgotten women's stories in London. So be they witches or harlots or forgotten women criminals or victims of crime, etc. I'm trying to get their stories told through these walking tours, but we also bring them to life, the stories, with theatre, comedy, elements of surprise, so it's entertaining and life is brought to it, but there is I hope the right balance of respect as well for the stories. So yeah, that's what I do, and I run 3 different tours once a month usually, although in some seasons I run more of them. For example, Halloween, because they tend to be dark history tours. They do really well in October. I've got a tour called Hex and the City, which is the story of London's witches. I have another one called Strumpets and Tarts, which is about the story of Georgian harlots in 18th century Covent Garden. And also Jailbirds of Old London. So this is the story of Victorian criminals or Victorian lady criminals, if you like, or alleged criminals in the 1800s and the early Edwardian period as well.
I also just love the names.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. They're so creative and fun. Yeah. And so within that, which I think it's so cool, walking tours are becoming so popular, I think, in cities, and especially since COVID, I think, because it's the option to be out of doors and doing something. But what really inspired you to start doing these tours?
Yeah. So you're right about COVID. That certainly inspired, because prior to doing this, I was working as a teacher, and I lost my job in COVID as a result of COVID. So I had quite a lot of time to sort of think about, do I really want to be doing this anymore? What do I want to be doing? And I did actually start, like, the first job I had post-COVID was a walking tour job. And this was working for, so that's kind of how I got into it, because it's outdoors, etc., all this kind of stuff. And I, I've always loved history. So I got into that, and then I really adored that job. But then sadly, I was, I kind of lost that. So I was let go from that job because of restructuring and various things going on. And at the same time, I had a really bad breakup. So, and plus COVID had just happened. So basically it was like everything all at once. And I just thought, I kind of had a mini crisis. And then I thought, actually, I want to write, I've got loads of ideas and I want to write my own stuff. So then I just wrote the Witch Tour, Hex and the City, which had been brewing for a while anyway. I'd had these ideas and I thought, I'm actually going to do this. I'm actually going to write it and give it a go and see if I can launch this, but with theatrical elements. And yeah, that coincided because I wanted to launch it at Halloween, which was, I didn't realize why that was such a good idea, but it really was a good idea because it did really well. And then I thought, oh, okay. I might make a business out of this. And then I ended up writing the second one, which was Harlots. So that was so the first one was 2021 and then the second one, 22. So I've been doing one a year. This year I did the Jailbirds and then I've got, another one I'll be launching next year.
Oh, amazing. Do you do all of them at the same time or is it just one a year?
No, so I'm running them. So as soon as I've written them, I launch it and then I'm running it on alongside the others. So the aim is to sort of build it up. So I'm doing quite a few. At the moment, I'm doing 3, as well as other jobs. But 3 tours. But hopefully, I'm hoping that I'll be doing enough that I won't need to do the other jobs, if you know what I mean. So I'm just doing this. That would be nice. I mean, eventually, if I can earn enough money. But yeah, and why was I attracted to these themes? You asked me, didn't you? Well, like the witches. I mean, that had been a lifelong interest anyway. I've always just been massively fascinated because I love the occult and the idea of the mysteries of the occult. And always loved playing with tarot and astrology and all of this stuff, so I kind of got really into this, researching these women and people that were persecuted for these things. So I thought, what's that about? So that, and then, the idea of the harlots kind of, I think I've always just loved the dark history, the dark side. Interestingly, actually, I don't know I know a lot of people don't believe in past lives or regressions or things like that, or maybe open to it. I don't know. But I love all this stuff. So I did have a regression. And I was told in the regression, or at least I told, it came out that I said that I'd been a witch hanged in a past life. And also I'd been cast out from a brothel for being pregnant in the Victorian period. And I was just coming out with this stuff. Now you could say that might be imagination because I'm into this stuff anyway, but I thought it was really interesting and that actually inspired me. I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to see if I can channel these memories or at least this info. And I do think it helps believing that we've been here before. But even if we haven't, we've got this transgenerational trauma, I think, passed through our ancestors that have been through this, and it's in our DNA. So I feel like, yeah, and I feel like as well with walking tours, certainly I've been on quite a few, I see these, maybe these stories mentioned, but not in a particularly feminist way. They're often sort of like made into horror stories, or like the witches, they're mentioned, but it's like, cackling old hags, and and the prostitutes are always really like wanton and sultry and sexy, and it's all about that. And it's actually the history is not like that at all. It's really quite grim and really, sad. So I wanted to get these actually true stories across.
Amazing. And It is true with those 3 are probably some of the most common sort of stereotypes of women. You're either a witch, a harlot, or a criminal, or all 3, depending on your story. But, as you were doing research for your tours, what do you feel like were sort of the consistent misconceptions that you found about these 3 separate sort of categories of women in history?
The persistent misconception in the past, I guess, which is more contemporary to these women's times, is that they were sort of naturally corrupt or evil, morally bankrupt. I don't know. And that, I think today, I mean, and that has certainly informed a lot of the historical research and the records, absolutely, in the way that these written were. I mean, if you look at the witch trial records, obviously, the way that they're listed there. But then if you look at, the writings about harlots in London, the prostitutes. I looked a lot at James Boswell, who was a writer, a contemporary of Dr. Johnson. And honestly, the way, I mean, he was a very esteemed writer, but I was absolutely disgusted by the way that he wrote about his encounters with very young prostitutes, which was just kind of considered completely normal. But they were just, it was almost like they viewed these women as choosing to do this, certainly in the 18th century. It was like their choice. And because there was something wrong with them, they were evil, with no recognition whatsoever of the conditions that caused them to go into this. I think it has changed slightly. I mean, well, a lot, obviously today we look at these, we've got a lot more understanding, a lot more empathy. We understand these terrible conditions. But something that I think's persisted a little bit is the idea that they're all of them. So whether it's a woman who's committed a crime or a prostitute or a witch, they're sort of sexually a little bit more wanton, if I want to say that, or more sexualized and as well glamorized. Because if we look at the depictions in media, in film, in TV, they're always displayed as the witches, the harlots, and women femme fatales, as being this sort of like overly sexualized, glamorous, often younger woman. And that's not the truth. That is not the truth of the matter. The majority of the witches persecuted were over the age of 50 for a start. They were poor, they were disabled, illiterate older women. The courtesans, which tend to be focused on, this was only a small proportion of women actually working in the sex trade. Vast majority, it wasn't glamorous, and they certainly weren't enjoying the sex. I've seen some TV shows where it shows them going, full makeup, like having a wonderful time. No, that wasn't the case. So I do think that has persisted, and I can see that in the propaganda of women who commit crime as well. We can see that still happening now, can't we? That persistent view that they are overly sexualized in some way, or evil because of their sexuality, maybe.
And then at least in the US with witches, it's usually like either the sorceress over sexualized, or the hag, as you mentioned. It is interesting to see those similarities between the three, even though the quote unquote crimes are so very different from each other. And so do you think that you tend to see more similarities between the three different categories, or more distinct differences?
It's a bit of both, really. I mean, there's definitely because if you look at the witch, the harlot, if you look at these archetypes, like the witch, the harlot, and the criminal woman, if you like, they're all women with agency. In some way, aren't they? They're displaying an agency, like independent of men. And so it's interesting how, the same stereotype, I think, is attached to them of being sexy or glamorous, whatever, to try and dilute that a little bit. So I think there's definitely that going on. But then at the same time, you've got, you're right. You've got, with the witches, for example, it's two binary kind of stereotypes. So either they are the mystical, mysterious, powerful, beautiful sorceress, as you mentioned, or it is literally the old, really old, but evil hag. That's the point, because she's old and she looks awful, and she's also evil because of that. And then with the prostitute, with the harlots, I feel like, they're either shown as high-end, beautiful courtesans, or you also see the complete opposite, like the completely helpless girl, or perhaps a slightly cunning, evil madam. That's it's always the stereo. It's always the archetypes, isn't it? So I actually think there are more similarities in many ways than differences. Yeah.
And it's interesting about the idea of agency, that all three of these archetypes were women who were usually outside of the social sphere, outside of the sphere of men. And do you think that is sort of why there's such a fascination? Like, I mean, in recent years, there's been so much sort of research into why are people into true crime? Why are people fascinated with these stories? And particularly with women who are in those spheres. And what do you sort of think that fascination comes from? Like, why are we obsessed with witches and harlots and then, you know, female serial killers or female criminals in general?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting actually that the research shows that it's mainly women that are fascinated with women in these roles, rather than particularly the female serial killers as well, which is interesting. And it's been suggested, I think this makes sense actually, that, you know, because of gender and cultural expectations, we as women, it's still not acceptable really to express rage in the same way that men express rage. So when we see, whether it's a witch, you know, hexing, creating some kind of diabolic spell, or maybe a prostitute, a harlot, you know, I don't know, fleecing a man and then killing her client or whatever it is, or a female criminal doing something, it's like it's safe for us to kind of project our fantasies onto that, like live vicariously through them, because we're not allowed to do that in real life. So I do think that's part of it, the fascination. And plus there is, in terms of the witches, this is definitely a huge trend with I think it goes hand in hand with the spiritual wellness movement, the kind of, you know, and Me Too, all the political movements, like, you know, the idea of the historical persecution of witches or of women kind of makes sense in the modern day context with the struggle against patriarchy. And then outsider culture, you know, in the idea of being ostracized, a lot of groups, I can see how a lot of traditionally outsider groups like ethnic groups or maybe, you know, gender identity groups can sort of like latch onto that as well. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think people are looking for meaning now, because look at the world, it's fucked. I know it's not, sorry, am I allowed to swear on here? I just suddenly realized, is this a family show? I swear all the time, it's terrible. But it's messed up, right? There's a lot going on, and we're in those times, what you know, psychologists have found is that people reach for the kind of occult as well, or spiritual stuff. So that might tie in with the fascination with witches as well, and this power that comes from that, you know, and an idea that we're empowering ourselves. Read the serial killers as well that are women. I mean, that's fascinating to us because it's less common. It is, you know, it is statistically less common, and it goes against the gender norms, doesn't it? Like,
absolutely, everything that we've been taught to think a woman goes against most of these, as well as sort of the occult or more religion that would get into the realm of being uncommon, or a woman who actively is sexual at all times, as a harlot would be, or a female serial killer, or just a female murderer in general. Those sort of all break the popular perception of what the female sex is and how they react and act and experience things.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's refreshing for us as women. But then I suppose for the patriarchy, it's a little bit disconcerting. And it might explain why women generally go for, I mean, I get, you know, as you would expect for feminist walking tours, I get mainly women on my tours, or women interested in my tour, which I would expect, you know, because I'm telling women's stories, etc. But I do think there is an element of, because it's funny, the reaction sometimes I get from men when I tell them what I do, they'll sort of be like, oh, are men allowed on your tours? You know, it's like there's almost this fear, like we're going to crucify them, you know, like, and I think it comes from the, you know, it's what I'm talking about as well. I'm talking about women who are quite fearful to men because of their agency. So it's, It is interesting. Yeah, I think there is that as well for sure.
Yeah, and it does seem to be more of a women fascinated in the stories also, which is it is interesting to see what's we are drawn to. And for you, as you were digging deeper, do you have sort of a few that were your just ultimate favorites in these categories, like women that became like, oh, I love talking about this person in particular?
Yes, so many. It's really hard to like to pinpoint. Let me think. So I mean, for the okay, so for the I'm actually writing. Interestingly, I'm writing one at the moment. Sorry to go a bit off topic, but about suffragettes. So yeah, the stories of the suffragettes and the sort of more forgotten suffragettes, rather than the ones that we all know about, the Pankhurst, etc. But there is one particular lady who has just blown me away because she's just incredible. She was a lady called Kitty Marion. That was her stage name, but her birth name was Katharina Schaefer. So she came from Germany to London. She escaped, she was being abused by her father, and she was, lost her mother, all this kind of thing. So she comes over to England and she wants to be a star because she's got an amazing singing voice. So she joins the music halls, becomes a star, but becomes a singer on the stage, music hall star. But then she joins the suffragettes because she finds out that she quickly learns, really, in Edwardian Britain at the time, the way to get up the ladder was the casting couch. And you had to basically just, if the directors or the producers asked you to sleep with them, do them a favor, then you had to do it. But she just didn't want to do this, and she thought this is wrong. So she watched, she went to a rally, she saw it, and she was really impressed by what the suffragettes were doing and campaigning for women's rights, the women's right to vote. So she joins. She's incredible because she was force-fed. I think she was arrested about 7 times, and she was force-fed about 300 times over the period of a few years. And on one occasion, on one stay in prison, she was force-fed. I can't get my head around this, but 200 times in one day. I mean, I don't know, because force feeding was horrendous. I mean, they shoved a tube down their throat, as you know, right? And then it was really painful. And then, upon her releases from prison, she'd just go straight back on the stage, although she did do the panto season or whatever it was. So she's incredible. I mean, she set fire to Kew Gardens. She did all kinds of crazy stuff, like, yeah, and sent letter bombs to Parliament. But she was, amazing. But she ended up, because World War One hit, because she's German, she was German, she was being she would have been deported back to Germany, and she realized this, so she ended up emigrating to New York. And then she lived out she lived out the rest of her days. That's why I wanted to mention her, you see. So she lived out the rest of her days in New York, but amazingly, she campaigned for birth control rights, and she joined the Birth Control League, or I've forgotten the exact name of it, but yeah. So she was working for that, and she ended up, dying, I think, in the 1940s in New York. But she's an amazing character. I mean, just so strong, and stood up she kept being taken through the court system. She kept standing up, defending herself in court. At that time, Edwardian England, for her to, she had no family here. She was completely alone. She was a foreigner. I think that's incredible.
Oh my God. Yeah. I love stories like that. And I can imagine, for any one of the archetypes, you can find so many of them, and so many of these stories, whether complete or incomplete, because who knows how many are just sort of referenced here and there. But, when you look at the historical records, knowing what time periods we're talking about, oftentimes the sort of villainization of these women makes a little more sense within the sort of cultural context. But even today, when we look at a lot of these women, especially, witches, harlots, criminals, they're still seen pretty negatively. And why do you think that has sort of remained unchanged for so long?
Well, I think that even though, we like to think, particularly in the West, that we live in this really gender balanced society in many ways, which, okay, compared to then we do, we've got the rules have changed, the laws have changed, at least it's a lot more balanced and fairer than it was. I don't think that human psychology has changed that much, really. And also, I think it takes a very long time for the values to, for these values and these ideas to completely disappear, because they're being passed down through the generations, aren't they? It's actually not that long since, if you look at women, okay, getting the vote in 1928, it's not really that long ago in the grand scheme of things, is it really? Not even 100 years yet. So in that's in England, of course. I'm talking about Britain, which is different elsewhere. But yeah, I think that, okay, our psychology hasn't changed. Patriarchy is still alive and well. Film, TV, media still perpetuates all of these ideas, these stereotypes. The idea of rape being, illegal in marriage. I think, I don't know about the US, but here in the UK, I think it was the 1990s that it was finally, it's illegal in marriage now. Prior to that, it's just insane, actually. So I think sometimes we think, oh, we've come a long way, but it's actually very, very recent. So that these changes have been made, and they've not really had the impact yet. So I think that's part of the reason why these stereotypes and mythologies still persist. And also, I mean, now I think there's quite a scary amount of misogyny that is sort of surfacing now. I mean, we've seen this, haven't we, with the backlash to Me Too and the online manosphere, the influencers that are now like really dominating a lot of like youngsters on TikTok are, in schools, like young guys are really being influenced by these people and these ideas that are really archaic. And I think, because I didn't grow up, I don't remember this in school. I don't remember the boys talking about women in this way, and apparently now they are, and that's really scary. So it's almost like a new wave of misogyny that's coming in, because what they'll do, they'll look at their fathers and the way they had it, or their grandfathers, or whatever the generations, and think, oh, well, this isn't, this doesn't make sense, does it? This is not the way, why am I being, and then these influencers, etc., they're very skillful at making them feel that it's women's fault for that. So it isn't that long. It isn't that long. I think we think it's, that's all the complete ancient history, all of that stuff, and it isn't really.
Definitely. And is that something you try to sort of point out, that I think for a lot of people, when they look at especially witch trials, it's like, oh, well, we don't do that anymore. We don't spectate and come to an execution to watch it with excitement. We don't sort of steamroll people and bring out obvious fake proof to like prove that they're this criminal or this witch. And yet it is, when you talk about social media, can be seen as very similar, just we're not watching an execution, but it's a different version of it.
Yeah, that's 100% it. It really is. And actually, it doesn't take much for it to spill out into the real world, because you can see how this hate builds up with these incel forums and stuff, where they'll start off by demonizing or going on about or women's looks, or feminism is cancer, or whatever it is, or the Karen, that's the new witch, the Karen. It really is. And it's really freaking, it seems harmless. It seems like banter. But then you get these crazies that, like in the 17th century, the witch hunter Matthew Hopkins or whoever, who will go out and lynch somebody in an actual town, and they do the same. They're doing the same now. I mean, this is encouraging young guys apparently to go out and kill their exes or attack their exes and stuff. So it's actually still happening in the real world. It's not being sanctioned like it was then by the church or by the state, but it's individuals who vigilantes, and it's helping to foment those ideas that women are the problem.
And I know that at least in the US, in regards to witches and for some female criminals as well, there has been sort of a push to relook at their cases, question if this is even an accurate crime. Do you feel like that is happening in the UK as well in regards to these trials sort of looking at the stories again? Or do you feel like it is still sort of those stereotypes and misconceptions?
Yeah, the issue with witches, I mean, certainly in Scotland, which is a different thing, but because their trials were quite different, and there were a lot more of them than in England. Um, but it really depends on who the leader is, because I know Nicola Sturgeon officially pardoned the witches, and there's been a lot of examining into those cases, and as a result, the pardon came, and then national monuments have been built to the witches. So there's been a real acknowledgement in Scotland of that trauma that was inflicted and that pain, and some honour given to them. Has it happened in England with our government? No, there's been nothing like that. No, absolutely nothing. I mean, there are so many organisations. There is a petition that is organised by, I can't remember who now, but they've sent it round. It's one of the Witches of England, groups that are trying to obtain a pardon for these women. But it has to go through the kind of bureaucracy of getting so many signatures, which I think it has, and then it has to be considered for a motion in Parliament and like a discussion and a debate. And even then, I don't have faith that that's going to happen. So I can't see how they're looking into any of these historic cases at all. The lady criminals, I was called lady killers. Lady killers, yes. I don't know if they're like specifically for women criminals, if they're like, they always, I think where there's been a cold case or something, like obviously before DNA, cold cases are like re-examined. There certainly was, I mean, there's one very sad miscarriage of justice regarding a woman called Edith Thompson, who was a North London sort of middle to upper class woman, and she was hanged for conspiring with her lover to kill her husband. But they're now looking at this, and it seems like she was framed for that. So I think that is being looked into, even though this was in, sorry, I should have said this was in the early 20th century. So we're talking about the 1920s. So, the 100th year anniversary of the case, it's sort of brought back up into the media, and that's a very, very sad case indeed, because she, and I think also because of her class is being considered. I think that's got a lot to do with it, as it always does. If she's in lower class, I'm not sure they would have, bothered resurrecting the case.
The economic status of a lot of these women will change the way they're viewed in history. And so, through your tours and through bringing these lesser known stories to the forefront, in the future, what would you hope these stories would create as a legacy for the public, for women who fit one or all of these archetypes and stereotypes?
I mean, I would hope that what I'm doing is telling their truth, and getting their truth stories out there, because in order to empathize, you need understanding of what's really happened. We need to dispel all these myths and silly stereotypes and ideas. So that's what I would hope, that at the very least the legacy would be that people would understand that these were women, but also human beings, functioning, trying to live their lives in the best way they could, in the confines of the society and the limitations that they were in at the time. I mean, to be honest, that should be all of our legacies, shouldn't it, really? Like, we've just been seen as human beings, but particularly because these are women that have been historically demonized and mythologized, so to actually see that they were ordinary people that were living ordinary lives mostly, and then they either through circumstance found themselves as prostitutes or somehow falling into criminal ways. I think that is because there is one particular case that I talk about on the Jailbirds, the Criminal Women Tour, which is really a horrific crime, and it's certain that she committed this crime, but there is still a human being behind that, and there is still a story behind that, and there's actually a lot of hardship and poverty, and it's a sad story, so I think it's important to look at this and to look at who they really were. So that's what I would want, and I think that's the only way really to get rid of these false ideas, so that when we watch films and when we watch TV shows that glamorize it, we can see that and we can be like, okay, that's just a Hollywood version. It's not the reality. Any of us could have been these women. This is it, because it's so easy to just see these mystical witches, like they're kind of sorceresses and magical women and all this, but they weren't. They were just ordinary women most of the time. And that is a persistent myth about them, that they had magical powers. I mean, I'm not saying magic doesn't exist and they couldn't do these things, but who knows? I think, and I think also as well, any of us could have been them. This is really important, but also I think it's good to recognize that how impressive it was actually, that they, in many cases, what they were doing and what they achieved in those limited times that they were in, and the sheer bravery of it, the courage of it, that's what I want to get across as well.
The bravery of it is something important to remember, that we think it's hard to do these things now, and you can only imagine what you were risking 200 years ago, 500 years ago, to live this kind of life and have that kind of agency. That's powerful, regardless of what you use that agency to do.
well, exactly. That's it. I mean, we can judge, but we've got to, at least admire their bravery in that, for sure. And it's only with the harlots, with the courtesans, I think, God, what they were up against. I mean, that was such a difficult life. That wasn't a glamorous life. It was a really difficult life. And okay, there were a select few that ended up living in a sort of gilded luxury at the end, but that was very rare. And even then they had significant, obstacles. They were so, in order to have that amount of power, to keep hold of their own money, that was incredible if they managed that in those times.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And next time I'm in London, I want to come on one of these tours.
But absolutely, you're always welcome.
And for my listeners, where would they go to find these tours if they are in the UK or planning a trip to London in the near future?
Sure. So they can go to my website if they want directly, which is www.herstoricaltours.co.uk. It's Herstorical, not historical. Yay, see what I did there. And if you're on social media, so on Instagram it's at Herstorical_tours_, and then if you're on Facebook it's at Herstorical Tours, all one word, which is confusing because it's different to the last link, but there we go. And then TikTok, which I'm not sure I'm going to stay on for too much longer because it drives me insane. But it's apparently what all the kids use now. TikTok is at Herstorical_tours_. So it's the same as the Instagram link. So,
and I will link all of those in the post about this episode. But I think that it is so important what you're doing and bringing these stories as much as possible to the forefront, trying to bring that necessary nuance is so important, and coupling it with theater. Who wouldn't enjoy it?
I mean, that's just to make it more fun, I guess. But yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, doing an interview, just getting to talk more about some of these fascinating women. I think it could start a rabbit hole for plenty of listeners starting to look up these stories and find more of them.
Well, thank you for doing what you do as well. It's brilliant.
Well, thank
you.
It's as long as we find more of us, we can all start to push those stories farther.
We'll form a coven and take over the world.
Oh, yeah. So fun. Sounds great. I'm in.
Oh yeah. We can do it. Got the power.